In this series of interviews we're doing about the Jersey child abuse scandal, we thought it would be really interesting to talk to the two police officers. And here today we have Graham Power. He was the policeman in charge of the whole the police force which is described in Jersey as the paid police force. And in this interview you'll hear a history of all his experience. He has a wealth of experience of policing. You'll hear about how he got to Jersey, his experience of policing in Jersey, what happened right up until the point that he was expelled from his job, he was suspended, and the ending of his career. Tell us where you'd worked, because you'd worked in some pretty difficult places, I think.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I started off as a boy cadet in Middlesbrough Police in 1964, would you believe? And progressed through Middlesbrough, which was absorbed into bigger forces. I remember being in Middlesbrough CID in the 1960s. I was driving a fast response car in sort of East Cleveland area in, I suppose, the 1970s, so far as I can recall. And I was in the rank of constable, I think, with about 8 years police service. Somewhere along the line, I applied for a Home Office scheme, which selected around 30 constables nationally and put them through an assessment process, which was designed or selected. Initially, more people went into the process, I mean, hundreds, but you could apply, and they were looking for about 30 who were considered to have high potential. And you worked your way through various stages and then went to a 3-day residential assessment centre where you were put through a lot of tests and given quite a hard time by a panel of assessors. And I was picked to be part of that scheme. So I then, a year away from home at the Police Staff College, training, which was of mixed value, but it gave me the qualification. And I went back to Cleveland Police, as it was then, and moved on quickly. In that, I did some time as an inspector, running a station on a very difficult housing estate. I had command of emergency response and special operations, and that included, because of the huge chemical complexes there were in Cleveland that time, you needed a fast action response to gas escapes and things. And we had quite a few of them, and some people sadly died in those sort of things. But sometimes evacuations, we had a special command room that we opened up for that type of situation. I was territorial commander, I think, in places like Stockton, Middlesbrough, for a while at Hartlepool, and gradually became superintendent in the headquarters at Cleveland. And I'd reached the sort of end of the line in Cleveland. I wanted to go somewhere else. So I applied and was successful in getting I forgot to say, somewhere along the route, I took 3 years out. And I read politics, philosophy, and economics at Queen's College, Oxford. Right. And graduated from Oxford, and then resumed a police career. So that was somewhere in that time when I was in Cleveland. I went to North Yorkshire as a chief super, divisional commander for a number of towns, Harrogate, Skipton, but also a whole, I couldn't tell you how many of these old, you don't see them now, except if you're watching Heartbeat or something like that, but these old one-man village police stations that are scattered throughout great tracts of the Yorkshire Dales. Yeah. I mean, when I would go to do appraisals or to visit police stations, I would take a sort of map and a car and a packet for the day, because it was huge. It was a day's work. I mean, you do 4 staff appraisals and visit half a dozen police stations, and you'd been going since 8 o'clock and you were getting home late. Quite an enormous area. And that had a sort of rosy image, but actually it was a very hard side to it, because the jewellers' shops in prosperous Harrogate were, if you're on a fast motorcycle, about 20 minutes out of Chapeltown in Leeds. And we were getting hit with armed robbers, and a lot of high-value dwellings were being attacked. And it needed a coordination with a sort of urban policing in West Yorkshire. and trying to protect rural communities. People think they've moved into North Yorkshire and it's an ideal. Well, it's an idyll, I meant to say. It is in a sense, but at the same time, you're seen as a target by people, like travelling criminal gangs. And so that was challenging work for a while. And I then applied for the senior command course. And that is the top level course at the police college. And it's designed to select chief officers for the future. And that again is another residential 3-day course, which takes no prisoners. I mean, it is really hard and ruthless assessment when you're in a variety of situations. I mean, you could be given a pile of papers about some corporate management issue, not necessarily in the police service, with lots of balance sheets and options and decisions that have to be taken. And you've got to write a letter to the MP, you've got to prepare a paper setting out the options and making recommendations. And you might have to share a board meeting and try and get your proposal and all that sort of thing was going on.
Tremendous.
I later became an assessor for that process, and I was chairman of a selection panel that was on the other side of the desk, and I could always say to people, I've been sitting in the chair you're sitting in, and oh, how horrible it is. There's nothing I can do about that. And so I got through that. And while I was on the course, the senior command course, again, another 6 months from home, quite high level stuff. I said you think you're clever till you meet the best of the best in other situations, and you realise there's some pretty high powered people out there. And I think during that time, I think I did an attachment to Woolworths when it was part of the Kingfisher Group. I think I worked with the company board for a little while, just looking at what they were doing and some of their corporate problems, and picking up stuff and trying to make suggestions. I did a study of policing in Denmark, which is again a different system, but you learn from looking at other countries, and that was a pleasant period. While I was on the course, I applied for a job as assistant chief constable at Lothian Borders Police, second largest Scottish force. And I was successful in that application. And I was assistant chief constable. When I'd finished the senior command course, I was assistant chief constable in Lothian Borders Police for a number of years. I did stuff there, which included I did some work in China. We had some sort of training partnership with the People's Procurate. They're the sort of equivalent of a Crown Prosecution Service in China. And I did some work with them in Scotland. And I also went to China and did some work with them out there. And that is, I mean, I wasn't the only one. The Lord Advocate from Scotland went as well. But what basically the theme of that was, the Chinese were saying is, look, we've come from being a peasant economy to a thriving capitalist country, and the legal system hasn't caught up. So if you ask us what Chinese law says about insider dealing or various forms of corporate corruption, well, in many cases it says nothing, because the lawmakers are running behind the economic development.
Yeah.
And so we were taking examples of how we dealt with things and that sort of stuff. That was a useful exchange, and other people carried that forward. But I think there became some political nervousness about it at the time, and I think it's something that's petered out. But it was a useful experience for me, and you'd like to think that the Chinese authorities got something out of it as well. I went to New Zealand to study for a reason. They were hosting the Commonwealth Conference. And the Commonwealth Conference, which is a third of the world's governments, was coming to Edinburgh. And so I spent some time I watched the whole Commonwealth Conference through in New Zealand, and spent some more time looking at New Zealand policing, and came back to Scotland, and I was operational commander for the Commonwealth Conference, which ran to, the figures are astounding. How many countries? We did hundreds of motorcades, all of which had to be protected and mapped, and bodyguarding for some delegations, trying to keep some of the delegations apart because of diplomatic difficulties, dealing with all the demonstrations and protests and all the sort of noises off that attracted. And that was successful. I thought it went rather well. And I think about that time I became Deputy Chief Constable in Lothian Borders Police. The existing deputy retired and I moved up. And my career in Lothian Borders was coming to an end, because in those times we were all on fixed term contracts. You signed up for 5 years or 3 years or whatever it was. And then at the end of it, you didn't have a job unless you found another one. And I got a 3-year contract at the Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland. That meant that I was second in command of a national inspection team. They always brought somebody from the outside to command it, I mean, rightly so. And we would go around in rotation, Scottish Police Forces, looking at performance, delivery, best practice, things that could be improved, report on the inspection of the force. It was reassurance for the political authorities and for the public. All of our reports were published. And I also had the specialist responsibilities in relation to professional standards issues. That, I think, was before I went into Lothian, before I went to the inspectorate, but during the inspectorate. So in a couple of cases, I was asked to look at cases that had gone horribly wrong and try and learn some lessons and produce an independent report. And I was getting near to the end of my time. Well, my police career in the UK ended because I'd been serving for 30 odd years by then. And it was time for me to retire. And I did. I left the police service in the UK, but about the same time, Jersey advertised for a police chief.
And you, if I might interrupt, it sounds like your experience of working with the dictatorship in China, your urban and rural mix of experience, your inspection of constabulary is a mix which actually made you perfect for Jersey.
Yeah, well, all right. I didn't see a dictatorship in China. I mean, I saw politics, clear enough, because you had some very well-educated people and very progressive people who were really keen to move the agenda forward. And sometimes we'd be met by them at the airport, and they'd be in smart suits and talking good English and all that sort of thing. And we'd be taken through, we'll take you through a security procedure, and a couple of little people in mouse suits with a different political attitude. And people would say, "Stop! Who are these people you're bringing through?" And you could see a tension in between people who were still in the sort of revolutionary tradition, and people who were in the modern society.
Well, it's a preparation for what you were going to encounter.
Yes, well, you could say that. Yes. I mean, I just loved it. It was all part of the.
Well, it's a magnificent experience, Graham. Much more than I think most people have.
So Jersey was a place to enjoy a kind of semi-retirement or
yes. Was it a retirement job? Yes. I mean, they're on the lookout for that. They said they would accept recent retired chief officers from the UK. And you can imagine who that might attract. Sunshine and cheap booze. We'll have some of that. But I must have convinced them I still had some energy left, and so there were some excellent people in the final shortlist, I've got to say, chief officers who I admire quite a lot and would have done every bit as good a job as me, and probably a better one. But on the day, I was successful. And I think the fact that I'd moved between, at least in 2 different countries, helped. Because the Jersey system is very different. And the fact that I'd successfully because you do get, and I still encounter them, senior police officers, very experienced, but they've only worked in 1 or 2 English forces. And if you don't do it the way they do it in England, it's just, you're doing it wrong. And of course, I'd moved from the English legal system, a Scottish legal system, which is miles apart.
Yeah.
And was judged to have successfully made a transition from policing in one country to policing in another country. And I think that ticked the boxes for them.
So what did you find? Did you find what you expected?
Yeah,
Jersey,
I mean, you could read
yeah.
most of it I'd read up on, and I thought, yeah, well, I was expecting that, and other stuff I'd read up, I hadn't. I mean, some stuff just took me by surprise, you know. And you've got to say, you explain that again. But you've got, what you haven't got to do is say, you can bring some of your experience with you. Say, look, when I was in Scotland, we had this way of doing this, and it was. But you've got to be very careful about that. That in Jersey, very difficult sometimes about the tradition, and I suppose rightly so, would say, look, we've been doing this for 800 years, and we don't want to be turned into a suburb of Hampshire. This is another country, and of course Jersey is another country. It's not part of the UK. It has its own legal system, its own National Health Service, its own social security system, its own courts, its own parliament. It is not part of the UK, and it's not bound by the laws of the UK. It is another country.
And it has a different police structure.
Yes.
By the sound of it.
It has, well, the professional policing, I can't remember, it might be 50 years or so it's been there, but it doesn't have a long history. The traditional system of policing in Jersey, which goes back 800 years or thereabouts, is an honorary system that each of the 12 Jersey parishes can elect a police force. So you can be elected. You go back to traditional model, you're elected constable of a parish, constable of a parish, and that automatically gives you a seat in the parliament, and you are the father of the parish, you're the chief prosecutor for the parish, you're the head of the policing, and you sit in the parliament, and you could be a member of the government. And centenarians, next level down, centenarians are the people who decide whether anyone's going to be prosecuted or charged or not. They would come out to the police station if someone's been arrested and charge a person. Professional police can't charge anybody. And the centenarian might say, send this person to a parish hall inquiry. You can have an informal hearing at the parish hall. You don't get a conviction, but you end up paying £50 to parish funds or something like that. Or I'll take this one to court, and the centenarian will present the case in court.
So just to clarify, you'd be the professional police and you'd arrest somebody for something, and then you'd have to call, if you wanted anybody charged,
yes,
you'd have to then call in the centenarian.
Yes.
Who would decide something.
Now what
decide whether the person's going to be charged and charge the person if they're going to be charged, yes.
But what qualifications would they have, Graham, those people?
The same type of people who you might find as lay magistrates in England. Members of society who have some sort of standing.
Yeah.
And you could be caught speeding in the parish and find yourself hauled before your former head teacher, who's now sitting as a centenarian, and he'd tell you you always were a bad and pay £50 to the parish and we'll let you off this time, or something like that. I'll tell you what, it works a lot better in practice than it does in theory. I have to say that. A lot of very dedicated people gave up their time. And at the bottom level, constables, officers and vanteniers would actually do police work. They'd have uniforms, police cars, and would be a visible presence in the parish and deal with your minor nuisances, your local lads and things like that. Stray cattle, we're always getting stray cattle in Jersey, that deal with that. And they're very good at events. If you want traffic controlling, they're very good at that. But the legal theory was that they're in charge, that we existed in order to support them.
Right.
And that was a source of tension. And I felt, a lot of people felt that rather had to be the other way around. And I did a lot of work, but got into a lot of confrontation, I suppose you'd have to call it, over getting that balance right. And it became particularly difficult when we started putting everything on computers, because you then had to have data sharing agreements. If people rang 999 and you said, yes, okay, I'm going to ask the honorary police to attend this, then there had to be some legal written agreement or basis for transferring that data, because you've rang us, you haven't rang them.
Yeah.
And then there's got to be some accountability about how to manage that information, so on. And that was a really difficult rubbing point, you know. And you had senior honorary police officers saying, "Oh well, no, you've got this wrong." But people ring you, okay, but you pass the message to us and we'll tell you what to do with it. You know, it's the other way around. And so no, we're not doing that. You know, we need to get a proper partnership agreement. And we did eventually get a partnership agreement, but it caused a lot of tension.
So did they view what I think they called the paid police, didn't they? Did they view the paid police with suspicion?
Yeah, yes. Well, they're trying to take over, aren't they? And the attitude was very much akin. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the early days of the England cricket team when there were two dressing rooms, one for gentlemen and the other for players.
Which were you, the paid police?
We were the players, they were the gentlemen. That was... and I suppose if you go back, well, I don't want to denigrate any of the previous leadership, because a lot of people did a very good job, but confrontations with disagreements, territorial disputes with the honorary police were a characteristic of the careers of chief officers way before me, and fallouts that had gone before. And there were genuine concerns. I know my predecessor was a good man. He's a local Jersey man, but he wasn't. You know, his heart was in professional policing. I mean, he had concern about recruitment standards. I mean, they recruited a paedophile. That's just simple fact. He's a good honorary police officer, yes, but he's got convictions for sexual offences against young people.
And everyone knew that. Everyone knew that, and they still.
Well, we knew it, and they knew it. They were told. And the Attorney General at the time was told, because I've seen the letter, though the Attorney General at the time said that he'd never crossed his desk and someone else must have dealt with it. I'm sorry to say, because I really like the person concerned, but I find that unconvincing. There was a lack of only went on to commit further offences. Roger Holland was his name. While he was an honorary police officer, and he went to jail. But questions, how on earth did that person, you know, and the professional, the state's police position, well, we told you not to do it, and you did it. So it's down to you.
And presumably, and there was a network of connections and relationships which you wouldn't know about when you came to the job.
Yes. Well, you half knew about it, but actually seeing it on the ground was quite remarkable. Honorary policing was a route into politics. A very substantial number of people who are in the Parliament had former honorary policing connections, and that network of relationships sort of ran through the island, and a lot of old Jersey families, sometimes interconnected families, that went back a long way. And you have to say, had contributed a lot to island life, and were giving their time, their energy, the money, whatever, to the good of the island. But if you read the report by Francis Oldham, QC, who chaired the Committee of Inquiry into Historic Abuse in Jersey, she talks a lot about the Jersey way and perceptions. She keeps putting perceptions in bold, because I've said that the system worked a lot better in practice than it did in theory, but the point is that in theory, the negative perceptions were huge. People believed, and still believe, that the island is run by a closed shop, a network of people who all look after each other, and if you're an ordinary person, you stand no chance of breaking through the system. That's the belief. It's not just what Francis Oldham, QC, found, these perceptions of the Jersey way. It's also what opinion polls have found. Subsequently, the state's statistics department has polled people on confidence in the various services that the government provides, and criminal justice has a very low perception in terms of integrity and impartiality. Certainly, the majority of people don't trust the criminal justice system, and I think at one poll I saw it was as high as 75% distrusted the criminal justice system. and I was asked about it at the time, I think privately, I said, I just can't work out who these 25% are, but actually think because it presents that image. And you've got to look at the interrelationships. I mean, the head of a prosecution, the Attorney General, is also the chief prosecutor, but he's also the senior legal advisor to the government and sits in the Parliament. I mean, that is compromise. He will say, and it's always a he in my time, but he will say, yes, but I'm a man of integrity and I do this job impeccably. And if there's any perception that I could be conflicted in any way, I'll send it to an advocate in the UK and get an independent legal. And all of that's true. But all right, I can understand that. I mean, I'd say, yeah, but who picks these advocates? And what happens to an advocate, a barrister in the UK who keeps giving you an opinion you don't like? And there's all sorts of questions can be.
And there are close connections between the Attorney General and then the bailiff and is it a deputy bailiff? In other words, they tend to succeed each other in their roles.
They don't have to.
No, but they tend
That's
to.
the way it usually works out. And I can think of no example when it hasn't been simply moving up the ladder. I can think of one who was Solicitor General and who dropped out of the system. And so you get a perception that nobody's going to really rock the boat on the way up.
How does something change from a perception to a demonstrable fact?
Yes. Well, it is a demonstrable fact in the minds of many people.
Well, indeed, but evidence is something different, isn't it? I mean,
but yes, they'll all back each other up. They'll all lie. They'll all cover up. It's no good trying. And you've got to say, I mean, I suppose we're talking to each other because of what came about in relation to historic child abuse.
Yes, of course.
And over again, hundreds of people were abused in Jersey institutions run by the Jersey government. And the committee of inquiry, the judge found there was, forget the precise words, but no political interest in the welfare of vulnerable children. The government was a negligent parent. It did not get on the interests of vulnerable children, did not get on the political radar, in spite of there being reports and advice from external experts that there was a real problem in Jersey and something needed to be done. It didn't get registered. We spoke.
Can I just hesitate? I mean, that getting on the radar is an interesting kind of idea, really, isn't it? Because if somebody's telling you something and you don't then act on it,
yes,
it's kind of has been on the radar, but it's been ignored. It's not quite not getting on the radar.
Yes. I suppose, yes, these things were aware of few people, but yes, it's not a I mean, it also suffered from a very distinct, and I might have talked about this, the committee of inquiry, Jersey characteristic, which I think is sometimes present in some European countries in relation to EU rules. And that is, if something came along that they felt, because of international expectations and what have you, that the government had to agree to, then they quite often agree to it, then not do it. I mean, that was a thing that they did. Oh yes, we'll sign up to that. I suppose we really must there. But if you ask the question, well, who's going to make that happen? Where's the action plan? Who's going to be responsible? Who will check in 6 months' time what you've actually delivered? So they would say about a report, oh yes, we accept that report. And Cecil Clothier did an excellent report with a committee on the policing of Jersey and how it ought to be modernised, and he wanted a single police authority overseeing all of the policing and a more modern structure. And the Jersey Parliament and government overwhelmingly accepted Cecil Clothier's report back in the 1990s. Just didn't do it then. Yes, we accept the report. Ooh, that was it. I mean, and so that is often how difficult contributions were dealt with. They were just agreed to, but then not done.
And it's very understandable that at a certain point, things had gone on for so long that lifting the lid on it became a huge public embarrassment and an embarrassment to the government of Jersey. And that provoked responses which were probably unhelpful. But at an earlier stage, ignoring it seems not really to be about being indifferent. It seems, I mean, there was no reason to ignore it unless you really thought it was unimportant or even approved of it. That is the abuse of vulnerable people. So, I mean, later on, it becomes something which you become embarrassed by because it's gone on and been covered up. But earlier on, it's covered up for other reasons, not out of embarrassment.
I think, to be precise, I don't think there are any independent experts who said abuse is going on in Jersey. What it said was that the organisation, your structure, your systems are just all wrong, and you're running a substantial risk that this sort of thing could be happening, and you're never going to know about it because not entirely the same.
But you did have the Victoria College experience, which was kind of earlier, before the major revelations
that was before
came out.
my time. Yes. That was at the Jersey Boys School. But
it wasn't only the victims saying something about it. There was also other people with some authority saying that there was a problem here which needed to be addressed.
Yes.
And there was a certain amount of resistance, if I understand it.
Yes. But that was quite awkward for a lot of people because the Victoria College produces the young men who go on to be in positions of authority in Jersey. There was a master who was abusing boys, doing it quite, as I recall, on a yacht that he would take out on weekends or whatever. And it eventually came to the notice of the police, but the attitude of the school authorities was very relaxed about it. And it was very clear that they weren't welcoming to a police investigation. The chairman of the board of governors at the time was a person who later went on to be Attorney General, bailiff, and senior judge. And I say that not to place any necessarily blame on him, but to say that this is an example of the sort of hierarchy and how it reaches into high places. Officers investigating report that they were impeded, that evidence went missing, that they got little support from senior officers. And I took the file, it happened before my time, but at some stage I took the file and sent it to an independent lawyer in the UK for an opinion. And because of these stories of obstruction and difficulty in non-cooperation, and I said, would you just give me an opinion? Should I be doing anything more about this? But it's years old. That's the problem. It's about 10-year-old or something now. And I got an opinion which said, it looks as if there were attempts to impede justice in the Victoria College case. And there are people who could have been interviewed under caution regarding what they did or didn't do in relation to this. But they'd probably argue now that the case has been closed and it would be an abusive process to come to, and probably they'd win that argument in court. And so my independent opinion,
it wasn't going to go anywhere. Yeah,
it's too late. It's too stale.
Yeah. Although I've seen quotes of somebody within the school commenting that the abuse of boys was a kind of compensation for the time this teacher was spending, giving these boys the experience out on boats, that you could see it as being a kind of, very reasonable, perk of the work the voluntary time he was putting in, which is kind of pretty blatant support for child abuse.
And even parents were clamouring for Jarvis Dyke, but he's such a that's the name of the man. He's such a good maths teacher. We don't want to lose him over this. We could. I mean, the sleepiness of the attitude was quite astounding. One of the officers in the case made a statement in which he is adamant that the term "perk of a job" was used.
Yes, quite.
Yeah, and well, I wasn't there. I don't know what was said, but
sure.
When you look at the whole background, it looks credible to me.
Sorry, Graham, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I came to this because of the documentary, the
Yes.
Storyville documentary, and it's easy to think just through watching that it's the very vulnerable children who are at risk. But in fact, I was then heard about Victoria College and thinking, well, this is a fee-paying school.
Yeah.
I think somebody called it the equivalent of Eton on Jersey.
Yes.
And there we have, those children are just as much at risk as the ones who are vulnerable because they are in a children's home.
I think it's sort of fee paying, but it's also subsidised by the Jersey taxpayer or something like that.
Right.
There's some arrangement.
Yeah.
Yes, but it built during the historic abuse investigation. A theme occurred over and over again that officers would talk to people and say, okay, you're talking to somebody about something that happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Why didn't you report it sooner? And the answer always was, well, there's no point. They would never do anything about it. In a few cases, people said, well, I did try and report it, but I was just chased away, told I was a tow rag and not to cause trouble. That was the attitude. There is no point because they will all gang up on me. And that's the perception problem. Might also have been a reality problem, I have to say.
Well, you had some experience then, didn't you? Because you did try and pursue it. You did take these people's statements and try and pursue it.
Yeah, we did. We oh dear. Well, I mean, it started off. I mean, neither myself nor any of the senior officers, Lenny Harper, any of us, are saying, "Oh, we spotted this and we realised we needed an inquiry." No, we weren't clever enough, or we weren't close enough to the ground to realise this problem existed. But an officer fairly well down the rank chain, I think, is detective inspector, so he had something about him. It was a bit like Oliver Twist and the Short Straw, or whatever it is, but he must have drawn the short straw because he put together a report that said, "Dear sir, you ought to know that we are picking up a lot of stuff about Haute de la Garenne, and there is sufficient to launch a historic abuse inquiry, and I think it's time the force did something about it." That report was submitted through a chain of command, and it went missing for 12 months. It didn't reach our desk, and eventually someone plucked up the courage to come to the top corridor, I think spoke to Lenny Harper and said, "Is anything going to happen about that report about historic abuse of Haute de la Garenne? What report? I've never seen it." Lenny, I wasn't told about this initially, but I think it was Lenny that then said, "Right, I'm going to get to the bottom of this." And inquiries were made, and it was found on a corner of somebody's desk or in somebody's drawer, with nothing having been done about it. We called in an outside force. I think it might have been South Yorkshire, I'm not sure, to investigate that. And I think the inquiry couldn't fail to find sufficient evidence for anyone to be charged with concealing that. But I think we were left with a clear picture of so we got the report, and 12 months after we should have got it, we started acting on it. This did not come from the top of the force. It came from good Jersey officers down at the coalface who said, "You've got a problem here, and it's about time the bosses spent less time didn't say, no, it's about time the bosses did something about it."
And in fact, this came, as I understand it, after you'd already had to uncover a whole lot of problems within the paid police to do with, how, I mean, was it, can I say, corruption amongst the police, and there was some arms dealing issues as well. So you'd already been lifting the lid on some other issues by then.
The state of Jersey police, I think it was a lax disciplinary regime, but it's very difficult. In Jersey, I've come across some of the most committed professional police officers you'd find anywhere, and they were very strongly motivated because they're actually policing their own community.
Yeah, it's a small community.
there's no escape from it. I mean, in the UK, quite often police officers commute and police places that they're never going to live in. You know, this is a horrible place. I provided with the police service for 10 hours a day or whatever it is, and then I go home and I've nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
You actually stood in the same queue in the supermarkets as everybody else. That was the plus. The negative side was that you had police officers, politicians, drug dealers, money launderers, lawyers, journalists, and all the rest who went to school with each other, sometimes related to each other, and trying to deal with professional compromise and conflicts of interest was always very difficult. I got into an issue with one custody sergeant about, look, you've kept somebody in custody when there's an argument you should have given him bail, and he's your brother-in-law who assaulted your sister or something like that. You know, shouldn't you have given that decision to somebody else? Well, he said, if you had to get somebody else every time you've got to take a decision to someone we're related to, you know, we'd be doing it all the time. I went to school with these people. You know, I know the families, and okay, this is not Birmingham or Sunderland. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm the only custody officer on duty. Do I really get somebody out of bed to say, will you take this decision instead of me, or something like that? Yeah. I mean, I don't think his argument was a strong one, but that was part of the fact is you've got to you're dealing with people all the time, but you know, and you know you and knew what you were like as a lad and what you got up to and that sort of thing. And you can't take people out of that. When Lothian Borders Police, when I was there, had 62 police stations. You could get a lot of people out of situations by saying, you need a fresh start. You know, do you know where Bathgate is? No, I don't. So well, you better find out because you're starting work there on Monday morning. And, you know, start again. Go and start again. Clear your locker out. Walk in. Nobody knows you. Nobody cares. Start again. I know that in Strathclyde, they used to sometimes send people to some island off the west coast. But, yes, just because that can do that. The stroke of a pen. Chief officer, you go where I send you. You know, you can't know where to send anybody.
No.
And so you can take a break in a discipline hearing or something, or you go down a canteen for a sandwich, and you're standing in a queue next to the guy whose case you're hearing.
And turning a blind eye to some of that is obviously absolutely essential in a place like Jersey.
Yes.
But then there are some things which clearly get over the boundary and are intolerable.
Yes, and we had that. I mean, we had police officers who were clearly in a relationship with drug dealers, who were helping criminals. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we have good intelligence that we couldn't use as evidence, but we knew full well that they were in contact. And one occasion, I think we planted some false intelligence on the computer system to see who looked at it, and then to see whether
who heard about it.
Acted on that, and you know, you could see. See.
Yeah.
People in relationships with men or women that were of interest to us, and I mean, it really was. It was so difficult. It's difficult for the cops as well as for us, because you're recruiting increasingly people who have experience of life. You recruit youngsters, but I rather had a liking for people in the 30s as police recruits. But they bring the baggage of life with them, and you know, getting them to understand the rules of. They want to go out on a Saturday night and have a drink and go to nightclubs and things like that, and it was quite challenging to maintain a rule. But some of the breaches were absolutely blatant. Ordered equipment being ordered for the police and then vanishing into somebody's private possession and all that sort of thing. And firearms licensing firearms licensing was another example. It was imposed on the island effectively after Dunblane. So they agreed to a firearms licensing system, then didn't do it. And so parishes took the money from people's firearms licenses, but didn't do any administration. So people moved, and the conflict of interest in a Conatab, who was the head of a parish, the firearms licensing authority, the head of prosecutions. I mean, quite lightheartedly, to sort of explain this compromise, I gave an example to the committee of inquiry. There was a Conatab in a parish who authorised himself to have quite a large collection of firearms. He issued himself with a licence. Then he moved house and didn't notify himself of his change of address, which meant that the records weren't updated, and where those guns were now, that there was no trace. They became lost in the system. This was drawn to his attention, but he'd broken the law by not recording a change of address, and he considered it, but decided not to prosecute himself. Well, I mean, that, the sort of
Is this real? Is that a real story?
Yes. And so you did with the committee of inquiry. In summary, recommendation 7 says, look, we've got to say something about this, but it was said better by one of the witnesses. I don't know which witness said, but Frances Oldham included this in her final report, where a witness said, we also have the impossible situation of a non-separation of powers between the judiciary and the political, and there is a lot of secrecy, non-transparency, and lack of openness. This brings with it a lack of trust, the fear factor that many have spoken about, and contributes greatly to the Jersey way. That's the words of a judge.
And do you think the Jersey way might have led to weapons falling into the hands of criminals or terrorists?
Well, I don't know about terrorists, but certainly, but not necessarily legally. Conatabs were issuing firearms certificates to people who had convictions for violence and drug dealing, that sort of thing. The standard was awful.
So then you've got this challenge of the child abuse.
Yes.
That you start to investigate properly, and it becomes a public investigation.
Yes.
And that obviously is in the context of all these relationships and connections and leaks between your force and the outside officials, etc. How did that go?
Oh, it was awful. I mean, we had to take sides, and we're taking sides with the victims and the people who got a story to tell. We're on their side, and Lenny Harper in his style has his critics, but one thing by positioning himself, whether on purpose or not, I mean, get him to talk about this, but positioning himself as effectively the enemy of a Jersey government, which is what he became, I suppose. I mean, they decided to make an enemy of him, actually was valuable to the inquiry in a sense, that it persuaded many people to come forward. People would say, well, I've been sitting on this for years, but no one was ever going to do anything till he came along. And because we've broken, it's a society of us and them. And people saying, I would never trust. And even during the inquiry, people say, okay, after 30 years, I'm willing to make a statement, but I'm not making it to a Jersey officer. I want one of these people you brought in from the UK to take my statement, because I just still don't trust them. I still don't trust them. They're all part of the system. And the climate of fear. Don't worry, we'll get you for this. The judge mentioned the climate. People gave evidence of the climate of fear, but if you step out of line, they'll get you at some point. I had a phone call from a Jersey politician. I think we spoke after I'd got back to the UK. And he said, look, all of this about you being set up for your suspension and things like that, it's all true. All what you're saying is true, and the politicians are telling lies. And I know they're telling lies because I've overheard them talking about it and sorting out what they're going to do, what they're going to say. I know
About
that.
you. What are we going to say about, yeah.
Yes. He said, I've overheard these discussions. He said, I'm going to say nothing. He said, I'm not going to say anything about what I've heard. He said, but you're all right. You're in the UK. You're safe. You've got your pension. They can't get you. But I've got family. I've got, you know, they're going to get me. If I speak out against them, they're going to take their revenge on me in some way. The judge talked about the climate of fear. And that's the climate of fear. They'll get you one way or the other. Don't you worry about it. It might not be for this, but wait till you want planning permission. Wait till you commit some minor breach. You know, wait till you try and go into business. Just try, and they'll remember you, and that you broke ranks, and they'll get you in some way or another. That's what people believe.
That sounds like.
But in fact, as I understand it, you were providing this umbrella to protect the investigation. I mean, you had to manage the kind of diplomatic relationship with government and officials, whilst allowing the investigation to carry on and protecting it from interference as far as you could.
Yes, yeah, that was the agreement. Said, Lenny, you get on with this inquiry. I mean, I think it was good that Lenny started the inquiry, but just for the record, from the very beginning, I concluded that both Lenny Harper and I ought to be replaced. That we didn't have the background that this, you know, Lenny had come to us with references that once described him as one of the outstanding detectives of his generation. But that, I think, had been 20 years previously. And most of my training and qualifications, I've been on a proper course for 10 or 15 years, were out of date. And so the plan to replace Lenny Harper and to replace me was rolling before we ever went to Hotel Le Grand, because I thought that was the right thing to do. But it got caught up in the Jersey bureaucracy and didn't happen as quickly as it should have and all that. But yeah, the agreement was, look, there'd been three of us initially at the head of the force, but the first guy, excellent detective from the UK, and we could have done with him, had left just before the thing took off. We'd always agreed that we were all due to go at the same time, and we'd agreed that we'd stagger this so we could hand over. And I said the guy who gets paid most ought to be the one who goes last out the door. You know, it's only fair, because they'll try to pick off the straggler. He went for Lenny was to go as soon as we could get a replacement, but I was to go after that. But I said, look, as long as you've got this, you just try and get on with the inquiry, and I will try. You're not available to speak to politicians or, you know, or what have you. I'll just try and deal with the political outfall and watch your back, and run the police force at the same time, because people were still burgling. When, you know, when they don't stop, criminals don't stop because you've got a major inquiry.
No.
And that was the arrangement. Yes, I tried to act as the buffer.
Yes.
And how did your suspension come about, Graham? I mean, I know that I know they didn't have any grounds. That's what the outcome is, isn't it? That they really they shouldn't have suspended you, but they did. Did they ever tell you why?
Yeah, they told me why, but it I mean, it's in writing. It wasn't true, and if they'd been planning it for a while, and they'd had suspension notices prepared in advance without putting in the date and what it was for.
But your name was on it, at least, not just kind of blank for whoever.
Yes, because I spent 12 months on a freedom of information case representing myself, because I wanted to know, can I have the evidence, the technical evidence, as to when these suspension notices are actually created. Of course, they were created in advance. They say they got a report or evidence on a particular day and decided to suspend, etc., etc. That was their story, but it was lies, because they'd they'd taken the decision in advance, then sent some hapless fool to find something to,
when you
to
say
put in
they,
gaps.
when you say Graham, who's they?
Yeah, right, okay. The people involved are the Chief Minister of the time, Frank Walker, the Home Affairs Minister, Andrew Lewis, and assisted by the Chief Executive, Bill Ogley, at the time. They had been meeting and trying to find a basis for suspension. They'd taken legal advice from both the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, who both provided legal advice, which in both cases said, you can't do this. You know, you have no legal basis for doing this. This becomes a little bit unpleasant because the deputy, we'd found a deputy, he wasn't appointed by me, who was going to take over from me. I was in the transition period. And somehow the guy who was going to take over from me was persuaded to say he'd seen a review report from Metropolitan Police, which was too confidential to share with the politicians, but it was critical of the inquiry. And he wasn't very impressed with the way I was leading the force anyway, and thought he could do a much better job. And that letter was used as the basis for the suspension. The Committee of Inquiry found that Andrew Lewis lied by saying he'd seen a report from the Metropolitan Police. He hadn't, and the Metro said no such report ever existed. But the fact is, I was suspended, and the guy who's my appointed successor was within 24 hours was sitting in my chair drawing my salary. I don't know what conversations took place off stage about that at all.
But the people who are conspiring, sound like they were the kind of second level of authority on the island.
Go on.
No, I was just wondering, how could they act in that way without the Governor General or the bailiff or the Attorney General being involved?
Well, they certainly wouldn't involve the governor. He represented the UK authorities, and they always weren't very keen on the UK authorities. Most of the time, there's a tension between Jersey and the UK. The bailiff, well, he's the senior judge, and he wouldn't get involved with that. So the chief minister in the political system was about as senior as you could get. And, you know, everyone, well, it's just absolutely true. But Andrew Lewis, he's not a heavyweight politician, nominally took the decision, but everyone thinks that the chief minister says so, had his, as I would say, his hand up his back and making sure that took, and that was revenge. I think revenge was part of the motive, because firstly, I'd allowed the inquiry to run, and I'd protected it against attempts to shut it down. And also, I got in a confrontation with Frank Walker over a previous, two or three things where I'd refused to toe the party line. I'd refused to get involved in the plot to sack Senator Stuart Sibray, who was an advocate for abused children and was giving the Jersey government a lot. He was sacked as health minister, and I was put under a lot of pressure to throw in my lot with that, say that he was demoralising staff and the criticism was unwarranted and so on. I wasn't having any of that, and I walked out of a meeting where I was under pressure to do that. Another occasion was when I just happened to be present when he was clearly trying to bully in an appalling way Wendy Kinnard, who was the Home Affairs Minister, and who was the only person who had authority over me, and which frustrated the Chief Minister. And he was behaving in an awful way towards her. She was very upset.
On the Storyville programme, he comes across as a kindly old gentleman who's concerned only for the victims of abuse and to avoid, unnecessary criticism of the civil servants in the education department. And is that a good impression of him?
if I was wanting to do an interview to convince people that I had the interests of the common people in heart, it sort of looks like a penthouse apartment overlooking the sea, and it might not be the setting I'd have chosen to do it. But well, he says, I didn't know about the abuse. Nobody told me. I find it terrific. Well, the judge says, because you weren't interested, Frank, actually. You had no interest at all. And when people tried to draw to your attention, you moved on to other things. You weren't interested. That's fair. And, you wonder if the boot, in fact, he'd been presiding over a government which had presided over institutionalized historic abuse as well. And he'd been in senior positions of a Jersey government for ages.
I want to draw a parallel, if I may, with the postmaster scandal that's has been breaking in the UK lately, where people have quite clearly said they knew nothing about it. If only somebody had told them, they would have put a stop to the prosecution or persecution of the postmasters.
Told me.
Nobody told them. They didn't know.
I wonder if captains of Royal Navy ships say that when they've run the ship into the rocks or something. But I was asleep at that time. If a boot had been on the other foot and someone had unearthed a scandal of systematic abuse of prisoners in the cells at Jersey Police Station, and it had been going on for years, and I had said, well, nobody told me, it's not my fault. I don't know what view Frank would have taken, but I don't think we were said, oh,
the same one.
If nobody told you, there's nothing to bother about. So yeah, I mean, whether the actual suspect, it's been found by eminent legal authorities that my suspension was based on false evidence, that it was against legal advice. I don't have to refight that battle. I just don't know.
Of course not. Yeah.
But it is symptomatic of the vengeance thing. Let's go back to the conversation I've had with others who said they'll get you in the end. You know what I mean? They'll find some way of getting you, because they want to set an example of this is what. And people would stop me in the street afterwards, firstly expressing support. I couldn't walk down the street without people want to shake my hand and say you're a fine fellow and all that. But say, look, think if they can do that to you, what can they do to us? That is a thing that people repeatedly said. It's an example, because I had passed my retirement date. I'd agreed to stay on to do a handover. The rules were clear. All they had to do was say, we consider the handover to be complete. You should now leave.
I think it's probably the most honourable way it could have ended, though, because if you had just left without anybody having a go at you, yes, you might have looked a little compromised. In fact, you obviously don't look in the slightest bit compromised, because they felt it necessary to try and punish you, which is probably a badge of honour.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Well, I mean, by the time I'd left, I'd had 46 years, man and boy, in the police service. I mean, a lot of that on and off over that 46 years, someone has said to me, you'll come to a sticky end, the way you go on.
But they're mostly villains, weren't they?
All right. Well, I'd made my choice. I mean, I used to work for an old detective sergeant, middle of CID, who once said to me, look, if you're really stuck, try doing what's right. And that's just the right thing to do. I looked at it, I thought, oh, blow this. I mean, these hundreds of people screaming out for justice, or at least some recognition, and these horrible, rich, slimy individuals want me to put a lid on it. Oh, which side? God, it's not a hard choice, is it? Come on. And also had in mind, God, what are they going to do to me?
Yeah.
I'm a retired UK cop with a UK police pension. I've paid into my Jersey pension. I can't see what's going to stop me getting it because I've paid for it.
Yeah.
They'll throw me out. Okay, well, I'm supposed to be gone already.
Well,
I mean, they spent millions of taxpayers' money on investigations that came to nothing, and my cost. I was suspended nearly 2 years on a chief constable's salary with my pension topped up. That's the Jersey taxpayers paying for that. And I'm getting a chief constable's pay for sitting on the beach. I mean, it's just mad, but they do that because they just wanted to see it as some sort, and to impose a rule of silence. As long as I was suspended, they could say you're not allowed to talk to the media. They knew once I'd finished that I'd talk to who I like, and they were trying to put off that wicked day.
Yeah. And was there just out of interest, was there a handover to your replacement? Did you have a hand?
Yes, well, I'd been handing over as deputy, but he might have decided that the handover had gone for long enough because he colluded with the people who were wanting to suspend me. He didn't last.
He didn't last, did you say?
No, he didn't last. He left.
Who was that?
David Walkup.
Right.
He came from Northumbria. I was no part in his appointment, but I was asked to write some notes on the applications, and I wrote on his, be aware that this man has only ever served in Northumbria Police. He doesn't even have the experience of being in a different police force in England, let alone a different, and you might find it disorientating or whatever, but there's issues about support and coping and so on. No, I mean, I don't know the full story about him leaving, but I do know that a lot of Jersey people turned against him when it came out what his part in it had been. And I've been told, I'm sure it's true, but his landlord asked him to leave his house. And that must have been sort of, he would have to think whether he really wanted to live with what he'd done.
He closed it down, didn't he? He more or less closed the investigation down.
If you study his words at the press conference, he refers to the abuse inquiry, but he always refers to it in the past tense. He doesn't say, and now I'm putting the lid on it, but he presents it as something, an episode which is through. And the number of reports, and I mean, people, again, I'd be stopped in the street by, for instance, a detective on the inquiry would say, look, don't tell anyone I told you, but since you've been suspended, we've just been fielding calls from victims and witnesses saying, come on, if you can do that to the chief, what are you going to do to me? I don't think I want to go through with this. They might do something terrible to me. It did sort of fizzle out. And then, but it re-emerged, and there have been prosecutions for historic abuse subsequent to that happening. I just think when I was suspended, when David Walkup took over, was a sort of dark period, and the force came out of that, and some excellent people have been leading it since and are leading it now. I think it cleared the air in many respects, but there are still people who, there is still the tension between the sort of old guard that says this is our island and we'll decide what goes on, and the forces that say no, actually we need to let some fresh air into this.
Do you think children are safe on Jersey, in the care of the state or in the educational system?
Well, not 100% safe, but I'm 100% safe anywhere. I don't. It's difficult to say when you haven't set foot in the place for years, for I'm in regular contact with people who live there. Or you can't deny things have improved. And there is a substantial effort going into maintaining a high standard of children's services in the island. People are working hard. Some good people are working hard. Some people have walked away from it saying, no, this isn't moving fast enough. And they haven't necessarily followed up from the Committee of Inquiry, which recommended that the recommendations of the Committee of Inquiry be subject to an action plan, a SMART plan, we would call it in business, and that regular reporting on progress. And so that is a bit lax. But there's always, of course, resourcing issues and priorities and so on. I think you find better, more capable people running things now than you did in my time. I'm sure of that. I am sure of it.